Good morning. I appreciate y'all being here this morning. I was kind of wondering with the weather, who would decide to get out of bed or not. And so I appreciate that y'all have and that y'all are here. First, a little bit of announcement. I didn't get an email from anybody over the weekend, so I'm assuming that y'all forgot about the quiz too. It's okay. We realized that we made the quiz in Canvas, but we forgot to make it publishable where y'all could see it. So it is now published in Canvas, and it'll be due Thursday morning before class. So you've got today and tomorrow to take it. And it's all over what we talked about the past 2 weeks, chapters 1 and chapter 2. There's roughly 10 questions, and you usually have about 15 minutes to take the quiz. So just kind of know that. It's enough time for you to think, but hopefully not enough time for you to just use your book to give the answers. I really want y'all to use these quizzes as a way to make sure that you have understood the things that we've talked about in class and have understood the reading. So it should be a personal check. It's only worth 10 points, so they're very low stakes, but make sure y'all get that done. If ever I tell y'all to do something and you go into Canvas and it's not there, do not hesitate to email Erin or I. Okay, we're humans, we make mistakes too, and so you will not offend us by calling us out on our mistakes. With that, today we are going to start talking about a whole new different segment of leadership theory. But for us to kind of remind ourselves how we got here, I want us to look back a little bit at where we've been. And so, our lovely little concept map that we've been working on. Let me mute this real quick so it hide video. Remember, we started out with the definition of leadership, and because of that, we had to describe, well, first off, what's the difference between a manager and a leader? We talked about the word influence in that definition and said that really influence is getting what you want, given what's available. And that's the definition of power. And so we talked about the 5 power bases and how we use those to get people to do what we want, and then what the 3 reactions are to power. So people are either going to be committed to what we ask them to do, they're either going to be compliant, or they're going to resist, either way. And so all of that set the stage for us to say, okay, now, what can we know about leadership? And the easiest place to start with that is to talk about traits. And that's where leadership theory all starts. And the whole focus of traits is this idea of who the leader is. It's completely leader-centric, right? Only focuses on the leader. And we said traits can be described as the characteristics of a person or the personality. And so with characteristics, we identified that through research, there are 5 major traits that tend to show up pretty often in all the different surveys and research studies that are done on what makes someone a leader. There was also this idea of the great man theory, right? And so we didn't talk a ton about it because it's kind of irrelevant now, but it's important to know that that was really the basis of trait theory. And then we said with the influx of psychology and wanting to really understand more about someone's personality or their demeanor, we looked at the big 5 and said, we can take any human being on this earth, we can see where they fall along these 5 dimensions of personality and be able to describe them pretty well. The thing about big 5, though, is it pretty much says that who you are stays pretty stable over time. That your personality, it may shift a little bit from year to year, but if we look at it in the long term, you pretty much are who you are, and that doesn't change a whole lot. Emotional intelligence, or EQ, on the other hand, is more focused on within your personality, how do you handle your emotions and how do you handle the emotions of those that you have relationships with. And the interesting part about EQ is that it has more of that growth mindset and says that even if you maybe have a lower emotional intelligence, with enough focus on development and just wanting to learn more and grow as a person, you can improve your emotional intelligence level. So again, that was kind of the whole of trait theory. Today, we're going to start talking about behavior theory. Now, what can y'all think of from trait theory that was missing? You know, the book gave us some strengths, some weaknesses. What were some of those weaknesses about trait theory?
It really give examples of day-to-day, excuse me, of day-to-day behavior. Obviously, that's really easy. But what that person does in a day and how they approach different situations, it just gives keywords of who they are.
Yeah, it's totally focused on typing a person versus really looking at their actions, their behaviors, their attitudes, their beliefs. There's more to us than just how people would describe us, right? So it doesn't even get into the nuance of who a leader is. It's very, like I said, it's typology. And we talked about that we have a lot of different personality assessments we take that type us, but sometimes that kind of puts us in a box, right? It doesn't fully explain the complexity of who we are as people. I like that. What other weaknesses are there about trait theory? What's missing?
There was never a definite list of traits.
Yeah. So yeah, no definite list of traits, right? Even though we kind of have this list of 5 major traits, it's still not very accurate, and things change a little bit depending on the culture, on the context. And so one thing that I've read about trait theory that I think is really interesting, and I think should be a really good caution to us when we use trait theory in leadership development, is that it's really easy with trait theory for us to get the results we want, right? Our personal interests, it's really easy to insert that into the outcomes or the results that we get from these different typologies, right? So if I think it's important for a leader to be introverted, can I create a typology where that's the most valued thing? And then can I give that survey to people and get the results I want from it? Yeah, it all depends on how I ask the question. So there's room for a lot of personal bias in trait theory, whether we realize it or not. A lot of it's that implicit bias that we talk about. So I think that's a really good point. There's no set list. And because of that, the list that you're going to get from people a lot of times is going to be influenced by their own personal bias. Any other weaknesses to trait theory? What's missing? Think about the definition of leadership. Is it only about the leader? What else is involved in leadership? Followers or other people, right? Our definition says it's an individual influencing a group of individuals. Does trait theory talk at all about the traits of the group of individuals? No. So we are completely missing half of the relational process of leadership. We're also completely missing context. And so it's important for y'all to see this, to know why our research has developed the way it is. Behavior theory, which we're talking about today, is trying to get one step closer to describing that process a little bit more. But what you need to know about it, and kind of the connection between trait and behavior, is that trait theory and behavior theory are still leader focused. Okay? For the most part, everything is still going to be focused on either who the leader is, which is trait theory, or what the leader does. So we are trying to get a little bit more into the actions of a leader to describe what they're doing, what their behavior looks like, but we're still kind of have our blinders on a little bit, still just looking at the leader themselves, okay? And so today we're going to cover quite a few perspectives on behavior theory. And you're going to see one piece of it that is really going to be what I like to call the backbone behind all of it. So here's what you need to know. Behavior approach, that's kind of what we call this. We have these approaches. We have the trait approach with a bunch of different theories. We have the behavior approach with a bunch of different theories. All about the behavior of the leader, what they do, how they act. Two kinds of behaviors are the focus here. So one thing that I want y'all to, I think I want to like kind of ingrain in y'all's brain. How many of y'all have ever been asked the question, what's your style of leadership? Okay. Bailey, how do you describe your style of leadership?
Because I like leading in a follower position because I like knowing what other people are thinking and how they're feeling before doing anything.
Okay.
So that's what I would say.
Okay. Anybody else want to kind of tell me how you would describe your style of leadership?
I think like through a relational manner, like I really like to build like my relationships with people, make them feel comfortable with me before I like ask them to do something or critique, give them feedback.
Okay.
I would say definitely mine's like more situational.
Okay.
That's what I put on my applications because I feel like I know when I'm best suited to like lead the situation, like in a group setting, and then I also know when to like step aside because someone else has better skills to lead at that point. So I guess that's what I would describe mine as.
I like that. So prior to our lesson today, we've kind of been trained or influenced to discuss our leadership styles really by describing who we are, right? Like some people may say, well, my leadership style is that I care a lot, that I listen, and we start listing off some types of behaviors, but really they're more traits about who we are. Behavior approach is leadership style. But what we're saying with behavior approach is that really people function between one of two different orientations. So your leadership style is either going to be more task-oriented or it's going to be more relationship-oriented, okay? And so we want to know the difference between those two things. Behavior approach, any of the theories that we're going to talk about here, pretty much are going to have this premise of task and relationship behind it. If you tend to be a more task-oriented person, you facilitate goal accomplishment. You help group members achieve objectives. So like it sounds, you're more focused on the task. If you are more relationship-oriented, you like people to feel comfortable with themselves. You perhaps maybe show more empathy. You care more about the person you're working with than the job you're necessarily doing. All right, and so when we talk about leadership styles in this class, undermining that is usually we're talking about what is that combination of task and relationship orientation, okay? We're not looking at traits of leaders or any of that stuff. We're simply looking at task and relationship. I'd like for y'all to pull out your questionnaire that you took for your homework, the LBQ, the Leadership Behavior Questionnaire. I want to go around the room and you can tell me what you scored. So you asked all these questions and then you summed up your scores and it gave you a number for task and gave you a number for relationship. I want to go around and I want you to tell me what was your task number and what was your relationship number. And I'll start with you, Arkin, if you don't mind.
I'm gonna be honest, I forgot to do it.
Okay, no problem.
My task was 39 and relationship was 42.
Okay.
Sorry, my task is 50 and my relationship is 28.
15 and 28?
50 and 28.
50 and 28.
Excuse me, my task is 38 and my relationship is 39.
Okay.
Task is 39, relationship 37.
Task 41, relationship 42.
Okay.
Task 39, relationship 38.
My task was 41 and my relationship was 39.
Task was 29, relationship 34.
31.
34.
Okay, 34.
Then my task was 33 and my relationship was
25.
I don't even remember my numbers, I forgot my paper.
No worries.
45. My task was 35, my relationship was 26.
My task was 49 and my relationship was 45.
Task was 31, relationship 40.
My task was 40 and my relationship was 49.
My task was 22 and relationship was 41. I forgot the score lines up there.
Okay.
My task was 48 and my relationship was 20.
Okay. We'll wait on Hannah to add, no pressure. I'll tell y'all what mine is. I'm honest. Do you have your answers?
I remember I did it for our other class, like another one. I think it was my relationship was like pretty high and my task was either medium or high.
We'll go with video here.
So for my task, I got 34 and my relationship, I got 26.
Okay, awesome. So this is going to be interesting to look at today. We kind of have a picture up here of what the class looks like. Looks like we are a class that is very high task, high relationship, all right? And that will mean something later. Some of us that scored kind of medium here, you know, we may have been higher in one area than the other. Those of us that may be low, me. You know, again, it's not a good, bad, wrong, or right. It's just who we are as people. And it's good for us to kind of have an idea of that as we get started talking and having this conversation about task and relationship. So one thing I will say is that I hope kind of after this class, when y'all get that question again of what's your style of leadership, you can be able to describe it more in terms of whether you focus on tasks or you focus on relationships. And you don't have to say, well, I'm task-oriented or I'm relationship-oriented, because are most people going to know what you're talking about there? No, not unless they study leadership theory. But you can describe your style in a much more accurate way. Okay, so there are all these questionnaires, but what we find is that when we started having this idea of what is task, what is relationship, how do we describe these styles, there were two universities that really started studying these things at the same time, and they almost didn't even realize that they were. And then they published their results and said, hey, we kind of called these different things, but at the end of the day, it really boils down to we both are describing task and relationship orientation. And the first one is what we call the Ohio State's study. So what they were doing is wanting to describe the behaviors of leaders. And so how they describe this, and you'll need to remember these terms. Like, it's really important that we know the difference between this. For the Ohio State studies, when they refer to task behaviors, they talk about it as initiating structure. Okay? How much structure do leaders provide for their subordinates? So this is a very workplace-focused study, right? They use the word subordinates here. And then relationship behaviors, they call it consideration, right? So leaders nurture subordinates. I really wish I had one more whiteboard in this class so that I didn't have to keep moving the screen up and down, but we're gonna make it work. What I'd like for y'all to do on your paper, just as a note, draw like a graph, right, with an X and Y axis. On the Y axis, I want you to label it relationship. And the x-axis, the horizontal line, label it task. So this is how a lot of times we graph this idea of like, what is your task orientation as compared to your relationship orientation? But it's also going to help you remember the terms that go with each. So underneath where you wrote relationship on the y-axis, right beside it, consideration. So you know, if you see the word consideration, you know that we're talking about relationship orientation. And then on the task axis, you can write initiating structure. Okay? So that's what came out of Ohio State. What you want to know about Ohio State that makes it different from the next study that we're going to talk about is that from their kind of viewpoint of how they did this study, they believe you are either task-oriented or you are either relationship-oriented. So they don't really have this like low, medium, high. It's like they divide it in half and you're either on this side or you're on this side. There's no switching. It kind of ties into that idea with traits that you are who you are. So you're either born relationship-oriented or you're either born task-oriented, okay? The other university that was doing similar studies at the same time was the University of Michigan. And so they were wanting to study the behavior of leaders, but it was a little bit more about how their behavior impacted the performance of the people that they worked with. And so the behaviors that they came up with, and again, it was kind of on this continuum, was employee orientation and production orientation. What do you think we would call employee orientation? If you have a strong human relations emphasis, what's your orientation? Task or relationship? Relationship. So you can put kind of on your chart over here, you can put employee. So you kind of remember that that's another one of the terms that we use for relationship. If you have a production orientation, so you stress the technical aspects of a job. Is that task or relationship? Task. Okay. All right. And so same thing here is that you had this continuum that you said, okay, leaders are either going to be production-oriented or employee-oriented. But the difference between the Michigan studies and the Ohio State studies is that Michigan said you can be both at the same time. So those of you who maybe had similar scores for both your task and your relationship orientation, Michigan would say, yep, totally possible. That makes sense. You can be high task and be high relationship, that they're not this like dichotomy that you're one or the other. All right? So big difference there that's important to note between the two. The third really big study is what we call the managerial grid, or Blake and Mouton's managerial grid. And so what's interesting about it is that they wanted to see how do leaders help their organizations fulfill their purpose, right? And this is kind of one of the first theories that gave us this idea of being able to describe ourselves as leaders based on our style. And the reason for that is that this theory in and of itself came up with 5 styles of leadership. And those 5 styles, again, it's not based off of your traits, it's not based off of your values, it's based off of that combination of task and relationship orientation, okay? And what they call task and relationship, the first one is concern for production. Is that task or relationship? Task, okay? So concern for production, CFP. Concern for people, task or relationship? Relationship, Okay? So concern for people. So essentially, we have 4 different terms to describe 2 styles of leadership. We have relationship style or relationship orientation, which can be called consideration, employee-oriented, or concern for people. We then have task styles. And task styles can be described as initiating structure, concern for production, or production-oriented. Okay? Make sure you kind of know which terms go with which study. All right? So here's how Blake and Mouton's managerial grid comes to play. So you have here the concern for production, which we call task. All right? And if you were to take an assessment with Blake and Mouton, you would get a score somewhere along the line of 1 to 9. And then for your relationship orientation or your concern for people, you would get a score somewhere between 1 and 9. We have 5 different styles that are based again on kind of that combination. So if you write down impoverished, this is what we call a 1-1 leader. And they're called that because score a 1, you're going to have a dot in here somewhere. So you're low task, low relationship. Okay? Impoverished management. So you don't really care so much about what you're being asked to do, what the job is. You don't really care about having a relationship with the people you work with. Any of y'all ever worked with an impoverished manager or an impoverished leader? Or have a friend who kind of, this is how they engage in class or group projects. They don't really care about getting the project done. They don't really care if it bothers you that they're not doing anything. Y'all ever worked with somebody like that? There's always someone like that in a group, right, for class projects. Then we move over here, authority compliance. So we call this a 9-1 leader. So you always have the x-axis number first. 9-1 leader. High production or concern for production. So very high task orientation. Low relationship orientation. So that one, again, if you were to map it, 9-1, the dot would be over here somewhere. Technically, when I take a task and relationship assessment, I am high task, low relationship. I would score as an authority compliance leader. And we can talk about whether that's good or bad. Okay? Now, on the flip side, if you have someone who's high concern for people, but low concern for task, we call that a 1-9 leader, because they would graph up there in what we call country club management. They care so much about who you are. They're going to make sure the environment is fun, that you feel good, you're enjoying what you're doing. Who cares if we don't get done today what we need to get done? Any of y'all? Just maybe describe yourself that way. Maybe your task and relationship didn't come out that way, but now if you kind of think about it, you're like, I'm usually that person in a group project. Anyone? Or you have that friend that you've kind of always got to keep them on track a little bit. Like it's really easy for them to kind of get off on the side and like they're having great conversations and like hearts to hearts, but you're like, we got a project due in 2 days. I love hearing about your mama and what's going on, but time to get to work. Okay? That would kind of be that idea of a country club leader or country club management. Someone who falls in the middle, so we call the middle of the road manager, that 5-5 person, that maybe they're medium when it comes to task orientation and medium when it comes to their relationship orientation. So there's not really, it's not that they're low or high, they're just kind of equaled out, balanced on both sides, middle of the road. And then finally, if someone is, and we seem to have a lot of y'all in here, high task, high relationship, that's a 9-9 leader, and that is team management. That's the 5th style that comes from Blake and Mouton's leadership or managerial grid. which style do you think is most effective?
I think it depends on the situation that you're in.
But let's think about what this theory says. This theory says you are who you are. So your relationship orientation is kind of set in stone. Your task orientation is set in stone. Who would we choose to, if we had a base who we chose as our leader based on what their style is, who would we often choose?
I would say in the middle of the road.
Okay, so you think middle of the road. Research shows us that most people say team. Like we automatically go to, we want someone who's high relationship, high task all the time. We think that is the most effective. But we go back a little bit to what Ashley said, and maybe it depends on the situation. Why might we not want, and this again is a criticism of behavior theory, right? We assume we want high in everything. But when might we not want a team leader? Can someone give me a circumstance or a situation where that might not be the most effective style?
Maybe if you have like a project, like a crucial deadline, like you really need to be working on, because then I feel like you can burn out a lot of your energy by being like very high relationship all the time.
Absolutely. So what would probably be the most effective leadership style in that situation if you have a project that's due in its crunch time?
I would say authority because it's high task.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Authority, compliance. So, you know, again, we hear that word authority and we're like, dictator, right? Like we kind of have that visceral reaction to it. But it may actually be more beneficial in certain situations. Tell me a situation when it might be most beneficial to have a country club leader.
I think when you're trying to either build a group or if it's a group built on relationships, like, I mean, I think of groups on campus where it's like Christian groups that get together, you want a leader who's very relationship based because that's how you're drawing those people in your mind, how they're trying to get something done.
Right. Maybe the job that you're being asked to do requires that development of relationship. And so you need somebody in that leadership position that not only values that, but is oriented that way. Absolutely. I think about counselors, right? Sometimes with counseling, there's never an actual like end goal or outcome. It's just about that relationship, you know, and it's just this continuing process. Okay, so definitely situations. Can y'all think of when we might want impoverished management? Because again, that sounds bad. That word impoverished seems to have this negative connotation. But when might that be the most beneficial leadership style?
I think when you're in high stress situations, you're always like that person that's very one-sided. Like they're not gonna make you choose one thing, they're just gonna like sit there. And so that makes you wanna work harder.
Yeah, so high,
Because I
yeah.
know in a lot of group projects, I've had that, but I wanted to work harder because of that person. So at the end, like, they've made us look better as a group.
So sometimes having the leader being an impoverished leader actually provides the opportunity for other people in the group to develop their leadership skills. You know, another time that I can think of when impoverished is needed is imagine that you've been working at the same job for 30 years. You have been doing the same thing. Any of y'all's parents had jobs that long? I know my parents have, right? Like, if someone were to come in as a new boss, which, I mean, we have a family business, so they are kind of each other's bosses. But say someone else, they bought our company and they came in and my dad had this new boss that all of a sudden was trying to tell my dad exactly what to do, but then at the same time was like kind of trying to be his best friend at the same time. How would my dad probably react? Or someone who's been on a job for a really long time. Like, get out of my business. I've been doing this for 30 years, right? So you have to look too at like what is the competency level of the followers, and that's kind of something that's missing from here. Again, another criticism is that again there's no real look or orientation towards who are the followers that are involved in this. But there are some situations where it's not effective if you go in and are so focused on task or so focused on building relationships. Sometimes that may not be what's necessary in this situation. So again, these are the 5 styles of the managerial grid. And again, the thing to note about this is it goes along those same lines that even though we can say, well, there may be contexts where one is more beneficial than the other, we're still typing who the leader is. We're trying to define their style. And we're saying that once we identify what your leadership style is, that doesn't really change. Okay? So if we look back here at y'all's original scores for task and relationship, and we're going to just kind of say as a class, like what this may be. If someone is, let's say, me, low relationship and high task, what type of leader are they? What's the style? Yep. Authority compliant. Okay. Now, if we say someone is kind of medium task, medium relationship, what style are they? Middle of the road. Okay. If we say that someone is high task, high relationship, what do we have? Team. Okay. And if we have someone that is high relationship, but let's say here low task, what do we have? And then again, if someone's low task, low relationship, what do we have? Impoverished. So based on your scores, you should be able to type yourself, right? Kind of where you fall along that line. And again, we didn't take the managerial grid assessment, but this is just a good place for us to start. We're not going over it in class, but one thing I do want to make sure when y'all download the notes or the PowerPoints from class today, make sure that you read through the slides on each of the styles. So it does give a little bit more description about, what that specific style or role is. And so you want to make sure you know that. Okay. Erin has for us today another little assessment that we're going to take. So this one's going to be interesting. So don't start it until I give y'all more instructions. So if I can have one copy of that. All right, so this is another way for us to kind of look at something. So this is called the least preferred coworker measure. So you're going to think of a person whom you can work least well with. Take a second. Let's put our phones up. And let's take a second and think about who is someone in the past or currently you just don't work well with. They drive you bonkers. Anytime you have the same shift as them, or you get put in a group project with them, you don't have to say their name out loud, and you're never going to have to write it down, but you know in your head that's who you're thinking of. Okay? Someone that you've had the most difficulty in getting a job done with. Okay? You are going to answer these questions. So you're going to rank them. Like number one is that, do you consider this person to be pleasant or unpleasant? And there's numbers there, but you're going to kind of circle the number that's closest to that continuum of how you would describe that person. So if you're like, well, I may not like working with a person, but I guess they are pretty pleasant, you might circle 8. But if you're like, they're kind of neither, circle 5. If you're like, oh, they're so unpleasant, circle a 1. Okay? You're going to do that for all these numbers. And again, this is not about you. It is about that individual you're thinking about that is the hardest for you to work with. Okay? Once you've answered all 18 questions, you want to add up your total. So you're going to take, if you circled 8, 8, 2, 2, 4, whatever the numbers are that you circled, add those up to get a total sum score. And write that total sum score there at the bottom. Everybody have their total? No? Let's give a couple more seconds. for the most part, it looks like everyone has it. Let's start in the back. What was your score?
96.
96?
58.
58.
82.
Oh, 52.
52? Okay. Okay.
38.
38? 53?
59.
59?
80.
80?
68.
Oh, sorry, I pointed to Bailey behind you.
109.
109? I'm so not surprised.
68.
68. Ashley's still working. 78? Okay.
64.
64. Ooh, you're like right on the line.
86. 27.
Okay.
81.
Oh, 81. 66.
104.
How about you, Erin?
I'm 56.
56? Okay. All right. You got everybody's? Okay. So this gives us a completely different way to think about what's our task and relationship orientation. If you scored low, so you had 57 or less, you are more task oriented, according to this assessment. If you scored high, if you had greater than 64, equal to or greater than, this means that you were more relationship oriented, okay? And then if you were in the middle here, it just means that you're more moderate. Think of that kind of middle of the road. So it's interesting. When we took the leadership behavior questionnaire, nobody was low on, like when it came to relationship. But yet, we do have some people on here who scored as very high task, right? You would think, for those of you who scored kind of the same for task and relationship, you think on this you would maybe end up somewhere in that moderate level, right? Because you're like, well, I seem to have both task and relationship orientation. But this is saying, again, it's kind of following in line with a majority of behavior style researchers and saying that no, you're really kind of more one way or the other, right? And we kind of can't be the best of both worlds all the time. And so we do have people that are high relationship, and we had a lot, but we also have a lot less people that are high relationship based on this. Why do you think there's a difference between these two assessments? Which one do you think more accurately describes you when you really think about it? And based off of what you know now about task and relationship orientation.
On this one, there's just less boxes to check, so it's like more condensed.
Much more condensed. You're also not thinking about yourself. So again, when we tend to take these assessments that ask us to kind of rate ourselves on things, we are great people, aren't we? Right? Or we have a tendency, whether we know it or not, to kind of answer these questions not truly based on who we are, but how we want to be. Okay? But when we take an assessment that's making us answer these questions based on someone else, why might that be a better representation of our true colors?
I just think about like who I chose to take like do this over, and it's actually something that like I also have to live with. So I think about like it's really hard for me, and I'm on the phone with my mom constantly just about the little things that she does, and I also know the kind of personality I have, and so I think like when I'm around her, like also like how do I feel about her, and I try to be really honest about that, because it's not fair to me just to be like, oh my god, I have to do this girl like 24/7. But I think that it just makes me more aware of like really how I interact with her, and that's how I base it off of how I interact with her, not how I see her interacting with other people.
Mhm.
And so I think that's a direct reflection of who I am too, if that's the only thing I'm basing it off of.
Right. So how did your kind of scores change, or did they at all between the two?
It said I was high relationship, and when I went and like just tallied the other one, it said I was high task, but it was very close to like middle of the road also. So there wasn't a huge difference, but I am very relationship based in that way. Like I am the kind of person that I would rather build a relationship than get something done. So.
Gotcha. And maybe because, like you said, the interaction you have with that individual, you tend to be more task oriented with that person, or that's kind of how you've chosen to deal with the situation. I don't know if that's a good way to put it. Because again, our personalities don't necessarily change, but we can shift our behavior a little bit, right? Any other thoughts? Anyone have a difference between how they scored on the first one versus what the LPC is telling you your orientation is? I like my LP results because mine tend to say I'm more moderate. So to me, it's like, I have some relationship orientation to me, whereas the other one makes it seem like I'm very low on relationship orientation. Any other thoughts maybe why you saw differences between the two? I always forget this is there. Anyone prefer their results from the LBQ instead of this particular one? You think that one's more accurate about yourself? Okay, here's the second question. Anyone score high relationship on the homework assessment, but you were high task oriented based off of the LPC? Anyone? Okay, why do you think that happened to you?
Because I put this in like a work situation, I guess, and like me and this girl did not get along. But she also didn't get along with my boss either, so she didn't last long. So I'm comparing myself to somebody else, I guess.
Gotcha.
Where like I wasn't in a work situation with the homework or hearing.
Okay. Okay, why do you think yours shifted?
I'm not really sure, to be honest with you, because last night when I was doing the assessment, I felt really happy about myself. So I felt like I was super outgoing, like, I don't know, I was in a good mood, but I'm not saying I'm not in a good mood now. I'm just saying, well, I think when I come to class, my mindset kind of changes, and so I feel like I can go over things a lot better, and I think that's why it changed. I think my mindset caused that.
Yeah. So yeah, there's all these factors that play into how we take some of these assessments. One thing to think about too is like, what is the context of the assessment? Both of these, again, are implying a form of hierarchy, that the person taking them is a leader who is leading other people, right? And so most of the situations that we see that in are in business situations or even organization situations. And so I think that's sometimes why there's a little bit of disconnect or dissonance between the results that we get from it and maybe how we feel like we truly are day in and day out, because we have a lot more relationships than just relationships with people we work with, right? And so you're like, I'm not all task oriented. I really care about my family. I really care about my friends. Like, those relationships are important. That's true. But what this is looking at is when you are in a business setting, when you are in an organizational leadership type position, are you more task oriented or are you more relationship oriented? And so I do think that's interesting. You can be a very gregarious, outgoing person with your friends, but the moment you walk into a business situation, it's a different game, right? Anybody feel that way? Yeah. That's why I never liked working on group projects with my friends, because I feel like they saw a side of me that maybe they didn't like all the time, because I do tend to be pretty task-oriented when it comes to getting stuff done. And so for me, it was kind of easier to do that with people that maybe I didn't have as close relationships with. Just kind of something to think about. What do y'all think behavior theory adds to leadership? What questions is it answering for us that we didn't have answered before?
See how we interact with the people we
Mm-hmm. How we interact, yeah. And again, there's not, we know personality doesn't change over time, and there's still some disagreement on this task and relationship orientation. Can you change over time? Can it shift? That's still totally up for debate right now. But I do think it gives us, again, some of that self-awareness, going back to emotional intelligence, of knowing, you know, this is how I am. And maybe for some situations it's appropriate, and for other situations it's not. Again, I know that I can be very task-oriented, but as a teacher, that sometimes is not the most important thing, right? So I have had to work over the past 10 years to be more relationship-oriented when it comes to teaching and working with students, and not being a taskmaster. And sometimes I don't have to be so hell-bent on due dates and all of those things, right? You can kind of have that self-awareness to know what's appropriate for the situation you're in or not. That's one of the big things, though, missing from this theory, is it doesn't really give us that context to know when we should possibly shift. On Thursday, we're going to talk about one other type of behavior theory. It's not in your book, so there's no reading that you have to do for it. It's just going to be a concept and a theory that I provide to y'all as a supplement. And we're going to do a little activity for it. Because we've got to do the things we've got to do with social distancing, my goal, fingers crossed, is that if it's not raining, we'll be able to do it outside underneath the awning here. So we'll still be able to do the activity. We're just going to shift it a little bit, do it outside, and then we'll probably come back in here to debrief it afterwards. So just kind of prepare for that depending on what the weather is that morning. Okay? Any questions for me? Yes.
So on the quiz, are you putting today's stuff on the quiz on Thursday?
No. Today's stuff will not be on the quiz. And again, make sure y'all get that quiz done before class on Thursday. So it will close at 9 a.m. All right? See y'all Thursday.